Jamie Hemmings with slamwrestling.net, and I'm speaking with Vance Nevada. Vance has a new book out, Uncontrolled Chaos, History of Canadian Professional Wrestling. Put it all in there. And Vance, you're currently in Alberta, but I'm actually coincidentally in your old stomping grounds. I'm outside of Winnipeg in Manitoba. And just want to acknowledge, because you got your start in Winnipeg in professional wrestling. So you'll be celebrating 30 years in the ring next year and coming upon.
We're trying to get there, but if my body holds up.
Yeah. So I wanted to also show everybody that you have another book, Wrestling in the Canadian West, kind of maybe the catalyst for going into the Uncontrolled Chaos book. This one's available on Crowbar Press if people are interested. But you've also done a lot of research for a lot of pro wrestling books that you've been credited for. I'm just wondering how you made the transition from wrestler to writer.
I think it's, it started early on where it was not really a case of even having aspirations to be a writer. I just became very interested in the history of wrestling. And so I started with, results research, in the summer of 1994 in the Winnipeg archives, which was kind of a neat place to do research because the archives building used to be the Winnipeg Civic Auditorium. So a lot of the matches that I was researching from the 1940s and 50s had actually taken place in the building. And so that was kind of neat where you're, scrolling through microfilm because that was the way of the day. But, you might be doing that on the exact place that history had occurred, so that was a really interesting environment. But as I got, I originally had anticipated that to be a summer project for something to do in 1994. And little did I know that, 28 years later, I'd still be digging.
So you've been working out since 1994. That's incredible. You brought up results. I wanted to mention, I know you've presented certain wrestlers with results, like kind of an almanac, as if you will, about their careers. Can you tell us about some of the people you've done that for?
Sure. You know what, that began, kind of by fluke, which is kind of a recurring theme in my life and career.
It's worked out well.
Yeah, it really started because I would be doing the results research and I'd say, oh, I'm going to get a chance to be in the car with this guy for 5 hours on a drive to Regina. So I'm going to bring my results book and see what gaps he can fill in. Like maybe we know Tony Condello ran a show in Sandy Bay, but we don't know what happened or who was on the show. We just know the date. And so I would bring these books on the road thinking that, just that information would be enough to jog guys' memories. And they would look at it and go, this is insane. What you've got here, I have no idea what you've missed. This is more thorough than I could have come up with myself. So I thought, okay, well, the next time I go on a trip with them, I'll just have their own career because then they might be able to more readily identify that, oh, this month here where you show no matches, I was actually wrestling in Africa at that time, or I was on a tour of Germany, or whatever the case would be. But it was sort of a recurring theme that every time I would present something, they'd be like, oh, you've got more here than I remember. And so when I did my first book, Wrestling in the Canadian West, then I started to put together those career records as a thank you to some of those legends that had given me the time of day. So one of the first ones that I did was for Don Leo Jonathan. Oh, yeah. And Don Leo had wrestled from 1950 to 1980 worldwide. And we had come up with, I think, something like 2,800 matches for his career. And when he was looking through it, he was like, I have no idea how you put this together, how you found this stuff. You've got stuff here that I don't even remember. But there's a lot of names here. You brought back a lot of good memories for me. Would you mind printing off 3 more copies of this? Because I'd like my kids to have a copy. And just from there, it sort of snowballed where, as I knew I was going to an event like the Cauliflower Alley Club, and knowing like how impactful this was on some of those individuals to now see their life, their life's work presented to them. It's resulted in some lasting friendships. So guys like Ted DiBiase and Terry Funk and Nick Bockwinkel. And so I would always, really dig into the research once the names of the guys who were going to be at the Cauliflower Alley Club that year were announced, and be like, oh, I'm going to get to see Alexis Smirnoff and Steve Kern. Okay, those are the the guys I'm going to research this year and put them together. And then as I got, some of my peers got into big roles with, TNA wrestling and WWE, it gave me kind of some access to people that I wouldn't get otherwise. So I was able to do records, and sometimes not just for the individual, but like a multi-generational family record, for example, like for the Orton family, to have Bob Sr., Bob Jr., and Randy, and get that to Randy Orton, or Hulk Hogan, Bret Hart, Steve Austin, Ric Flair.
Wow.
So there's, I've done probably more than 200 records that have been issued to the wrestlers themselves. And it's never going to be something that I do for money. It's just always just a great feeling to give back to some of these people in a way that is very unique.
You brought up the Cauliflower Alley Club, and as we're talking, they're currently having their reunion, I think number 36. And you're also the editor of The Ear, which is their quarterly newsletter. So obviously you're just drawn to preserving professional wrestling history. This means a lot to you.
The guy who was really instrumental in getting me connected with the Cauliflower Alley Club and sort of embedding me into the culture of that organization was a mutual friend of ours, Bob Leonard, from Regina.
He's my mentor, yes.
And so Bob and I had first met in 1997 when I was wrestling in Regina. And as he saw some of the projects that I was working on from time to time, he said, "You really should come to Vegas. I think that you'd really enjoy it." And so I went to my first reunion in 1999, the year they held it in Waterloo, Iowa. And then I didn't go again until 2010 in Las Vegas. And at that point in 2010, wrestling in the Canadian West had come out, and, really Bob kind of just like threw an arm around me and was like, "I'm going to make sure that everyone in this building knows who you are."
That's
and then through that process, introduced me to Carl Lauer, who was the president of the club. And they said, "Listen, you have a great understanding of the industry. You're a wrestler yourself. We know that you appreciate the history. We want to get you involved. And we could see you being part of the administration sometime down the road." But it started with being on some of the award committees that they have for the awards that they issue. So I was on the Future Legend Award Committee, which is kind of identifying a current rising star that deserves some recognition. And then also, once you've been awarded the Historian Award through the club, now you're on the committee. So I think I was like the third or fourth guy maybe to get that award. So the committee was pretty small, and it was easy. And now we're now several years later, so this committee is now large. And so
still very deserving though. Let's not let you
coming to a consensus on the honorees now is a much bigger task.
Still a great honor to get the James C. Melby Historian Award. So I'm glad you mentioned Bob Leonard. He was my mentor, and I miss him very much. And as I was reading the Saskatchewan section, because that's where I'm from, I loved reading about him. I loved reading about Principal Richard Pound, or John Cosman, who is no longer with us. And I went to a lot of high impact wrestling indie shows in Saskatchewan, and took my husband, and I believe we saw the debut of Cannonball Kelly, who also got mentioned. And he was kind of this underdog that really could grab you, and he had everybody in the palm of his hand. We're just rooting for him. So I just love that people like that nobody else maybe would know, but they're getting their due, and just, they made a contribution, so they should be mentioned. So I just love that. Do you think being a wrestler helped or hindered your writing?
In the beginning, it definitely hindered, because the wrestling culture, first of all, there's like this inherent mistrust of media. And so even if you said, "Hey, I'm writing a book," right? Well, then they're really suspicious about what you're writing about and how they're going to be represented, or what secrets you're spilling. Because it's not that long ago that, breaking kayfabe was a very serious offense in the wrestling business. And, one of those incidents is identified in the book that occurred in the Winnipeg Arena, where a gentleman was perceived of having spoken out of school, and as a result, had a match with Mad Dog Vachon in the Winnipeg Arena, and spent 6 months in traction, or six weeks in traction rather.
Yeah.
So there was that at the beginning, but I think, after Wrestling in the Canadian West came out in 2009, there definitely was a greater understanding about what it is that I'm trying to accomplish. And so people were a lot more forthcoming the second time around. And definitely there is an advantage to not, particularly when you're talking about some of those key moments in history and what it meant. So it's not just, like you talk about Vince McMahon and his national expansion. Well, what did it mean when he came and he broke the monopoly of the Winnipeg Arena? How did that impact what was happening? How did him taking over the television time slot, how was that a key piece of what he was doing? Where sometimes, people will say, yeah, this is what happened, but to really drill down a little bit more from a wrestling context, this is what impact that actually had.
So how did you come up with the title Uncontrolled Chaos?
Yeah, I think that's just my life.
It's very suitable for pro wrestling, I think.
Yeah, I think it's it speaks a little bit to dispelling a bit of a myth about what people think of professional wrestling from the outside, where they think, oh yeah, that's all fake or that's all scripted, where they don't really have any idea how real it is. And that's kind of stealing a line from Bret Hart. But backstage, where on any given night, somebody got hurt the night before, or they just simply no-showed, and now you've got 4 weeks of promotion and lead up that you need to now explain away as you make a change on the card. And in the old school way, they just say, oh, that's why we put card subject to change with the little asterisk at the bottom of the poster. But if you have fans that are devoted and have been following along, those changes still matter to them, for them to understand, well, hey, I thought I was coming to see a chain match tonight, and now that match isn't happening, and neither of the wrestlers that were advertised are here. So there's a lot of things like that happen. But there's also a lot of like real life animosity backstage, where, sort of along that vein of familiarity breeds contempt. If you've been in a program with somebody for a long time and your personalities don't really jive with each other, you have a lot of people sitting on edge all night long, wondering what's going to happen when these guys get in the ring together. Are they going to keep it professional? Is something going to go down? Do we want something to go down? We might, because that's going to generate some notoriety for the next match down the road and sell more tickets. But where is this going to go? So Uncontrolled Chaos is really, I think, reflective of particularly independent wrestling,
Yes,
as we see it.
So when you were talking, you talk about pro wrestling in each of the Canadian provinces, and you start out the section with a top 25 of list of prolific wrestlers of the era in this region. And I'm wondering, lists can be so debatable all the time. I'm wondering what the criteria rather was for assembling these lists.
Yeah, and the lists, I debated heavily, whether to include them or not to include them, because they're going to be the piece that somebody wants to pick apart.
Yeah.
But in the same way, when we're having the conversation about, you could say any territory, the Maritimes at the height of the territories, who were the standouts of that time, and typically the guys that you'll see in the top 4 or 5 are names that get repeated often.
Yeah.
But then when you start to look a little bit deeper and say, oh geez, I never realized that guy had such a big career in that part of the country during that time period. And there's a lot of those guys that ranked 21, 22, 23, 24 that as you dig into the story and get appreciation, not just for the main eventers, but for the guys who were the workhorses that really put in the time.
Well, I just liked, just coming from Saskatchewan, that there were people that I remember watching when I was in university, living in Regina. So I'd go to the wrestling shows, and when I met my husband, and I'd take him to the wrestling shows. So that's what I just really enjoyed. And then as a military wife, I've moved around so often. So, I've gotten to go to indie shows in other provinces, and some I didn't know anything about. Like, I have never gone to indie wrestling in the Maritimes, where my husband's from. So that's why I really like the book. So when I was reading the section on the Manitoba indie wrestling scene, which I was really interested because that's where I'm currently living, there's a lot of scheming, betrayal, and sabotage amongst the various promoters. And that's where you debuted at age 17 in 1993. And you even mentioned, and this just was so crazy to me, that at age 19, you became the booker. So what was it like to write this section when you're in the midst of it? You're really personally involved.
I think that, the Manitoba piece was the hardest to write because there's definitely information that you have because you were there at the scene at the time. But you also have to be very cautious not to have whatever side of the issue you were on be colored as the good guy in every situation, because definitely there were times when the sandbox politics of Winnipeg wrestling, there were no good guys. It was just everybody trying to outdo the other guy, in the slyest way possible. And I definitely was both a propagator and a victim of those situations, right? I still have challenges at the US border to this day because of Winnipeg wrestling politics in 1997. Where, a vindictive rival promoter had called ahead to the border to let them know that I was going to be crossing without a work visa. And as a result, I got a 5-year ban from traveling to the United States.
That's so
This is the
dirty.
level of things, right?
That's
There was,
terrible.
there was guys that thought it was funny to play practical jokes that cost guys their marriages.
You
there was
mentioned that one
so
in the
much.
book. Somebody claimed they were pregnant from the promoter to that promoter's wife, and they ended up getting split because
Yeah,
that's crazy.
it was just such a toxic environment for a period of time where you're just like, you guys have lost your total perspective on what it is that we're trying to do here. And at the point when you've now taken that wrestling conflict out of a wrestling environment where it has real life impacts on people's marriages, on their jobs, on their livelihoods, yeah, it was tough. And I would say for the most part, trying to keep it to a general audience, some of that stuff has been not excluded or censored, but definitely we didn't even get into the depth of how gross things got there.
That's incredible, because that chapter, I just couldn't believe it. I take notes and write questions as I'm reading, and I was writing wow and like highlighting and like telling my husband after, I'm like, did you got to know this one guy tried to steal a ring post and they had a show the next day, like just craziness. Is that, maybe I was wondering, because when you write about yourself in the book, you never say I, you say Vance Nevada. Was that part of that, trying to keep a good perspective about what was going on at the time?
Yeah, and I also wanted to make sure that there definitely were stories in there that aren't positive about me. And some of the things that to this day I still deeply regret. But yeah, I was involved in this this situation, and I definitely was the bad guy in that situation, and that's in there. So if I can be that honest about my own involvement when I was dishonorable, then I'm going to be that honest about everybody. But I always try to temper that with, I don't want to tell a story that affects someone's job
Mhm.
or their marriage, right? So if anyone's looking for dirt about, well, we want to know about illicit drug use or things that were happening, no, you're not going to find that story there.
Not that kind of book.
Yeah,
But there's plenty other debauchery in there. Like, you'll have your fill of debauchery.
there's lots. I mean, we've
Yeah.
got those types of sandbox politics between promoters all chasing the same $5, but right up to broken nose of a future prime minister of Canada. So
Yes,
those
it
are
was
all
Paul
things.
Martin. Yes, I remember. I told my
Yeah,
husband about that too. Yeah. See, I did read it in case. Yes, it's massive. It's a big, I got the hardcover edition here, but I read it. So um, another part of this book that is just incredible, you have all these records. And I think I just want to, it's a record system that reflects more than 600 championships that have been recognized by more than 200 Canada-based wrestling organizations in Canada's history of pro wrestling, of course. And you point out that in a lot of these promotions, the people were not keeping detailed records. They weren't like, here, Vance, yes, I have it right here. So I'm just wondering, why would you take this massive undertaking on, and how did you go about it? Because it's just incredible.
I think that's kind of one of the great ironies. We're kind of in this like information age now where there's so much is available by Google, but it's actually often harder to find out the results from the shows last weekend than it is to get results from the 1930s.
Really?
Because the newspaper coverage back in the day, like when they really like were, pursuing and covering the sport as legitimate contest, I would say from the 30s to the 50s, the coverage was thorough and
Yeah.
intense. So some of that, some of those promotions, looking at Red Garner in Toronto or Silvio Sampson in Montreal, who had these long careers, lengthy, promotional reigns, and doing some pretty big shows for the day that have been overlooked over time. When now you could take a look at this, what happened to be, the first place that Pat Patterson or Mad Dog Vachon wrestled in some of their earliest, title reigns, for example, are reflected, often a decade before people were even aware that they were, in the game. So some of those discoveries are really cool and to be able to share.
Can you talk about you made an interesting discovery about Roddy Piper's debut?
I think that one of the things that I wrestle with, pun fully intended, is that, the book is intended to celebrate professional wrestling, but in sometimes doing so, you have to break down some of these myths that have been, often told and repeated. And so, Roddy Piper is one where his origins in wrestling are just sort of like this myth that have been allowed to grow, where we've all heard this story, and it was on his DVD set about his first professional match ever in the Winnipeg Arena against Larry Henning, which was the shortest match in Winnipeg wrestling history. And that match did happen. It was indeed like a 9-second match, and it was reported the next day in the newspapers as the shortest match in Winnipeg history. But it wasn't Roddy's debut. He had debuted 2 years earlier, on the local independent scene, trained by Tony Condello, wrestled against Tony Condello in his debut match. And in fact, if you watch the Born to Be Rowdy DVD, as Roddy's talking about his early career, one of the screenshots they show of him with a guy in a side headlock is Tony Condello.
Oh,
you can see
okay.
the TC on his boots. But so you kind of say, oh, well, we'll give that one to you, Roddy, though, because maybe, you sort of cut your teeth on the independents, but, or at that time they weren't independents, they were outlaw shows, because you weren't part of the network. But Roddy Piper's first match for the AWA was actually against Ric Flair, which to me is actually a more interesting story, considering the long relationship that the two of them had and the fondness they had for each other right up to Roddy's passing.
They even did on the show Wife Swap, their families switched, Roddy and Ric Flair's. So
yeah,
just a little trivia.
So, yeah.
It all started with them. Vance, what do you want people to take away from your book?
I think just really a grander appreciation for just how much wrestling has occurred in Canada, and how many great wrestlers have come out of the country, and how many Hall of Fame careers got their start here. And when you look particularly at Stu Hart's Dungeon and see how many guys that went on to become world champion or WWE Hall of Famers got their start there, or Vancouver or Montreal or Toronto, right? It's such a rich history, that really anything that's been done so far has only scratched the surface. So, as my peers have been getting the book, they'll be like, whoa, this is a big boy, right? And I say, yeah, but, I wanted to be thorough.
It's definitely thorough. This is not a weekend read. I don't want to scare anybody. It's a really interesting read, but yeah, it's going to take you longer than a weekend. It's longer than a Netflix binge, but something.
Well, and that was a bit of an argument with the publisher right out of the gate. So they got the initial manuscript, and they do a manuscript assessment,
right?
And they send back, like, here's what we recommend, for this to become a bestseller, here's what we need you to do. So they first pass said, typically a book is 80,000 words. Your book is 239,000 words. We're going to need you to cut it. I said, you're asking me to cut 2/3 of this book? I'm not cutting one word. This is not intended to be, your best-selling, the great American novel, as it were, right? This is a history book,
Yeah.
and we are not cutting a single syllable. And so luckily I had some really good support within the publishing office, where they went to bat for me and said, no, based on the scope of what this work is, we're not cutting it. We're gonna run it. And so that's why we've got 462 pages and as much information as we could jam pack in there.
But it's a quality book, and again, I don't want people to be scared of it because we call it a history book. Like, yes, this is something I'm probably going to look up stuff in, but like, there's great stories in here, like, and they're talking about indie wrestlers that probably don't always get mentioned. They also, you mentioned about women, how women wrestlers had to fight because, like, in Canada, they weren't allowed to fight everywhere. It kind of was, this province would, and then this province would, and this province, no, we're taking a stand. We're definitely not allowing women to wrestle. So like, there's a lot in here. That's just, I'm sure you could do another one.
I think it's, particularly around the story of women, I find it really interesting, particularly in this time right now in 2022, where you think about the shows that have happened in Saudi Arabia in recent years, where the WWE is taking all of this, flack from people saying, well, why would you go there to a country that's so oppressive to women? And, they have these restrictions on what they're allowed to wear, and they need to be like fully covered, like, to their wrists and to their necks. And those were the same regulations that we had in Canada in the 1960s. It wasn't that long ago that we were the same, right? Where, you had jurisdictions saying, well, we can't have seats on the floor when the women wrestlers are here because it's a fire hazard. Okay, but it wasn't a fire hazard for men's wrestling the week before.
Right.
So what's really going on here? Right. And it's really interesting to see, how it's not just, jurisdictional. You had like, organized religion come out to bat against women's wrestling. You had local governments, you had police, fire, all, through their own perspective, taking the moral high ground to not allow this. And some of the ridiculous things that happened as sort of the stopgap in between, where, Ontario would allow it, but they couldn't be classified as wrestling matches. They had to be self-defense demonstrations.
Right. Yeah.
And so there was a lot of weirdness. And so, as you look at that trend, you really get a greater appreciation for some of those pioneering women who had to endure that in order to make a living. But, certainly there's a great advantage to all the work that they did when you take a look at how women's wrestling has exploded in Canada over the last 20 years.
Well, and even I still, like, when I started watching wrestling when I was 7, I never thought I'd see women main event WrestleMania. So it's just that's why I love that chapter too, because we've come such a long way. So I was really glad that you included that too. So you talk about the territories, and how that kind of, when Vince McMahon kind of demolished the territories, we kind of had the emergence of the indies. So I'm wondering, if Vince McMahon hadn't have come along with his, WWF, now WWE, what do you think pro wrestling in Canada would look like?
I think pro wrestling still would have had a death, in terms of the model that it was using. And part of that I would attribute directly to the way that television operates. So you've gone away from having these independent television stations in each of those markets, where now it's all part of a national affiliation, right? So we've got CBC, CTV, and Global. They pretty much dominate everything. So in the case of Vancouver, you had this really folksy, wrestling show happening every Wednesday night, television taping in the BCTV studios, which are now Global Studios. As they went to sort of national product, that's one, strike that would have hurt wrestling, where, if you're going to have wrestling on TV, it needs to have a national brand, a national appeal. And nobody was really running with that kind of budget to do that, where, you consider, again, Vancouver and even Calgary, they were taping over their own tapes to save the cost, right? So a lot of those libraries don't exist anymore because it was all about cost cutting. But even more so than that, then you consider when we got into the 1990s and early 2000s and political correctness became a thing. All of those villains that we had in the 1980s and in the most colorful era of wrestling now are culturally inappropriate. So, the idea that, and those in sort of ingrained cultural stereotypes where, anybody who was British was automatically a syrupy British lord, and anybody who was Japanese was automatically sneaky and was going to throw salt, or the sheiks or
Yeah.
whatever stereotype you wanted to play, that wasn't going to play anymore. And so, as you saw, even in the early 90s, when the independents started going, wrestling had a hard time adjusting to that. And I think even now, we've sort of come to accept that and found ways to get the color and the characters that we need without having to rely on that old model. But even now, we're having the same struggles as we adapt to the new social norms of, now how does this factor when you have people saying that professional wrestling needs to be a safe space? How do we navigate sexuality, and transgendered wrestlers in this environment where typically it was very rigid traditionally. So we'll continue to evolve and figure out how wrestling remains relevant, but with how quickly things changed at the end of the 80s and into the 90s, I don't think wrestling would have been ready to adapt anyway.
So you have 2 books, and like I said, you've contributed research to a lot of pro wrestling books. Is there any chance we're getting another book by Vance Nevada?
I would say the chances are highly likely, much to the dismay of my wife. I think that there's definitely a natural follow-up to Uncontrolled Chaos that becomes a nice complementary 2-book reference to say, like, okay, we've talked about the timeline and the history of Canadian wrestling, and now let's get into detail about the all-time Canadian wrestling roster. So I'm starting to put together that list, and doing the statistics for this book was a good jump off point for that. But I would say sort of similar in the way that the WWE Encyclopedia has done their big illustrated book of their all-time roster.
Have one for Canadian
doing something
indie?
like that, but all Canadian.
Yeah.
So only for wrestlers that were born in Canada or formerly immigrated here that have competed in Canada.
You got to have Principal Pound and Cannonball Kelly, or my husband's going to revolt.
They're definitely in there by name and by photo.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great idea. So that would be great. So how can readers get a copy? Of course, like the usual places, Amazon, but you have a website too for the book?
Yeah, so you can order direct at uncontrolledchaosbook.com.
Okay.
And that will take you right to the Friesen Press website where you can order that directly to be shipped. It's also available in hardcover, paperback, and ebook. So on Apple Books and Google Play, you can get the e-edition, and it's available through a number of retailers. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Chapters. I'm not sure how many are carrying the book physically in store yet, but it's available on their websites. So it's been really cool to see the distribution that Friesen Press has, where the book is available locally in the UK and Australia and the United States.
And you've gotten a few people to pose with the book. You've been posting that all over Facebook. Who are some of the names that have been your favorites so far that you've gotten to?
It's been absolutely incredible. And actually, just before we got on the call today, I just got a whole bunch of photos from the Cauliflower Alley Club reunion. Nice. And the book is there. I'm not.
Yeah.
But there's many people down there that have been gracious, and I don't want to give those away because you'll see those get posted in the next few days. But the Canadian independent wrestlers that I've crossed paths with have been so gracious and so amazing. to share. And even book, as books are arriving in the East, I'm getting photos from fans and wrestlers as well posing with the book. Just this past Monday, Kevin Owens from the WWE has done an endorsement pose with the
Not
book
bad,
as well.
not too shabby.
Yeah, so it's been really, really fantastic to see how well this book has been embraced, by the wrestling industry. And I think I've only had one person reach out to me to say that they were upset about the book because I had missed their illustrious independent title reign in Winnipeg at some point in the last 15 years. But other than that one negative one of the 200 plus copies of the book that are out already across North America and beyond, the feedback has been really fantastic.
This has been so great to talk to you. Glad we've been emailing for a while, but we haven't ever gotten to talk in person. So I just wanted to know if there was anything you wanted to add, anything you missed. We'll hold up the book again for people to see.
Yeah, I think I'm really overwhelmed. I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the contributions from some of the historians that have contributed their pieces. So Dr. Nathan Hatton from Lakehead University, who kind of did the introduction at the beginning, talking about pre-1930 professional wrestling in Canada. Rob Seeley on the East Coast, who's really like the prime guy in terms of Maritimes history and contributed a lot from research he's done, and was one of the first guys that I reached out to say, Rob, did I get the Maritimes right? Because if I got it wrong, you're going to be the guy that knows. And so many, wrestlers and promoters that were so giving of their time, and their experiences in a very candid manner. It just wouldn't be possible without their participation. And the photographers.
Yes.
There's so many great photographers from across the country that probably are doing it for free out of a love of the game, that are down snapping photos of independent shows. Particularly, the book would not be as complete without the photos. The story just is much more compelling with some of those images, and I'm so thankful to all the photographers that have allowed me to feature their work.
Well, I just want to again thank you so much, and we'll show the book again just to wrap up here. But this is Uncontrolled Chaos by Vance Nevada, and I'm so thrilled that I got to talk to you and that you sent me a copy. And it was just so nostalgic and just brought up a lot of memories. So thank you so much.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Hulk Hogan, yeah. You say you don't know where the Macho Man is coming from? Yeah, you're right. You don't know anything about the Macho Man, Randy Savage, and where I'm coming from. Because it's mind-boggling to you, yeah. How one man could make it to the top of the World Wrestling Federation mountain, yeah. All by myself. No pukesters helping me to the left. And no pukesters helping me to the right. Didn't need 'em then, don't need 'em now.